I want to begin by quoting the jury in the Manhattan hush money payment trial. Guilty, 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 guilty. This was what the jury pronounced unanimously on every count. My Republican colleagues don't really contest Donald Trump's guilt. This is the fascinating thing. Their argument is essentially he should never have been prosecuted, or they falsely claim it was a political prosecution, or they falsely claim it should have been a misdemeanor, not a felony. But they don't contest, not really, that Donald Trump was making hush money payments to a porn star to hide their affair from voters. What they're really saying is they're more than comfortable nominating and electing as the President of the United States someone making hush money payments to a porn star. The party formerly of the moral majority is now, I suppose, hoping to fashion some kind of immoral majority to reinstate Donald Trump as president. The presidency, the most powerful office in the world, and not the most powerful because of the size of our military, but because of the power of our ideas. And what is the animating idea of a Trump presidency? It is dictatorship. It is power at all costs. And this is also tragically the animating idea of the Republicans on this committee. Power at all costs. What else can explain what it would profit them to give up their political soul but a world of power? Ambassador Eisen, I want to ask historian Eisen a question. Is there any period of our history that sheds light on what we're going through today? Have we ever seen one party or the other so completely abandon oath to the Constitution, commitment to truth, commitment to decency, so willing to tear down the rule of law, our institutions, our justice system, anything that gets in the way of power? Have we ever seen anything like this?
Three periods come to mind, Mr. Schiff. The first is the founding period, and in particular, the ferment between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, when the founders and the framers, famously the Federalist Papers, a passage you know well, worried about that in that period of instability, a tyrant would arise. That was resolved by one of the fortunate accidents, not just in American history, but I dare say in the history of the world, George Washington's establishing the tradition of peaceful transition that Donald Trump ultimately broke for the first time in our history. Number two, the Civil War period, when we had those within who also proclaimed that they would not accept American rule of law. And that period of divisiveness is also found in the post-Civil War era, the decline of Reconstruction, that assault on our constitutional system that became the Jim Crow era. Those are three precedents. We see other dangers, including here in Congress, the period of McCarthyism. Donald Trump represents the most grave danger to this country, at least since the end of Jim Crow, very likely since the commencement of the Civil War, and perhaps since the founding of our nation from within.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you,
Chairman,
Mr. Speaker. This amendment creates a prohibition on the transfer of cluster munitions. I'd like to begin by thanking my co-lead on this measure, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, and many of the members who have been fighting to get rid of cluster munitions as part of modern warfare, including Representative Titus, Representative Omar, Representative McGovern. And I would simply observe that if there's an amendment that is supported from Omar to Gaetz with Jacobs and McGovern and Titus in it, it must be a great idea, and we ought to probably adopt it. According to the New York Times, since World War II, cluster munitions have killed an estimated 86,500 civilians. Additionally, Human Rights Watch and the UN have reported that cluster munitions in Ukraine have killed or wounded 890 people in 2022, 95% of whom were civilians. If Congress continues to flood the battlefield in Ukraine with indiscriminate killing instruments like cluster munitions, the blood of everyone impacted, including children harmed, will indeed be on our hands. We should halt the transfer of cluster munitions to any country. We stand rarely isolated in the modern world by still sending these things. And I mean, we're still demining cluster munitions in Laos, for goodness sakes. I hate the notion that American taxpayers are going to have to pay for cluster munitions. A bunch of civilians are going to die, and then years from now, we'll be back here paying to demine the very cluster munitions we sent out. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to claim time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by yielding 30 seconds to my friend, the chairman of the committee, Mr. Rogers from Alabama.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you. I thank my colleague. This amendment would have serious consequences to our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific as they face down China and North Korea. Former Indo-PACOM Commander Admiral Harris highlighted the cluster munitions are essential in a potential conflict with North Korea. And I would point out China and Russia have not banned cluster munitions. We also should not wait until the fighting starts to transfer these weapons. Deterrence depends on getting real and effective weapons like cluster munitions in place before a potential fight. I urge a no on this amendment.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized. Florida. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Florida man here. I would simply observe that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons. And so if we're relying on cluster munitions as the deterrent, it seems to be pretty nonsensical. I would yield such time as she may consume to the co-lead on this measure, Ms. Jacobs.
Where's your phone? Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment with Congressman Gaetz to prohibit the transfer of cluster munitions. Most U.S. allies, including almost every NATO member, have joined the Convention on Cluster Munitions, but not the United States. That is a grave mistake because these weapons maim and kill civilians indiscriminately and can be lethal indefinitely. It's reported that up to 40% of these weapons don't explode on impact. And if they don't explode, they become literal ticking time bombs, scattering tiny bomblets that are more like landmines. And even if the dud rate is far lower than 40%, the risk to civilians, to children, to our moral authority is too great. In 2021, the Landmine and Cluster Munitions Monitor found that over 97% of casualties from cluster bomb remnants were civilians, and 2/3 of those were children. And that's because these deadly weapons don't look dangerous. In fact, they look interesting to kids. They look like toys. So when kids find these weapons in trees, in the water, or on the ground, they often try and pick them up and can end up losing a limb or their life. No amount of guardrails for cluster munitions is enough. No amount of so-called tactical advantage is enough. It isn't enough to say the other side is doing it, so we might as well too. It's not worth it when civilian lives are at stake. It's not worth it when our reputation is at stake. Our commitment to our core democratic values, like protecting civilians, abiding by international humanitarian law, and upholding human rights, is the foundation of our reputation on the world stage, and it's what allows us to build and maintain international coalitions to make the world a better place and advance our national security goals. That's why we need to ban the transfer of these weapons, so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to point out that we all care about Ukrainian kids, but you know who cares about Ukrainian kids the most? Ukrainians. Ukrainians care about Ukrainian kids. And they're the ones asking for these munitions to use on their own territory. They understand the consequences. They understand the dud rates. They understand the danger. But most of all, they understand the danger of losing this war to Russia, having their kids kidnapped, taken away, or killed. That's why the Ukrainians want these munitions, and that's why we're giving them to them. Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I would object to the proposition that the House of Representatives has to outsource our thinking on the cluster munitions questions to Ukraine. Like, when did we substitute their judgment for ours? And I think that this notion that they're essential to warfighting is belied by the actual casualty numbers. If you believe that 95% of the people killed were children, not enemy combatants, which is what the New York Times is telling us, then I think that adoption of the amendment is appropriate. And yeah, we should not be in a race to the bottom for the weapon systems that are the least discriminate and are the most harmful to people who are not engaged in warfare. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman, my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Moulton. I oppose this amendment. Prohibiting the transfer of cluster munitions, specifically in the context of Ukraine, would have disastrous impacts on the Ukrainian ability to push back war criminal Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine. Russia is currently using every weapon in their arsenal, including cluster munitions, to murder civilians and hit civilian infrastructure. I have seen firsthand in Bucha, Ukraine, where families were forced from their home, their hands were tied behind their back, and then the Putin troops shot the members of the family in the head and buried them in the yard. We must fight back. Additionally, in the Indo-Pacific, it has been reported by Admiral Harry Harris that this is a deterrent to the dictatorship of Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and that is that we know the largest artillery complex in the world is facing the people of Seoul, Korea. We're in a conflict we did not choose of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law, threatening civilians. And it's always been clear that Ukraine is the first invasion of this current conflict, and with further promises by Putin to restore the Soviet Union by invading Georgia and Moldova, threatening Armenia, Estonia, and Poland, we know that we must support Ukraine as essential for Ukraine, as essential for the United States. We can see that today, as Putin has sent nuclear warships to Cuba, 90 miles away from our border. We must stand together with the people of Ukraine and provide them the best equipment to stop the war criminal Putin. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I sure hope we don't have to rely on cluster munitions to deter submarines off the coast of Florida, because not being a munitions expert, I would suggest that probably wouldn't be too effective, because I think the submarines are in the water. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to close. May I inquire how much time I have left?
Gentleman from
prepared to close.
Florida is prepared to close. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized to close. The gentleman has the right to close. The gentleman has the right to close from Florida.
How much time do I have remaining, Mr. Speaker?
You have how much time? You have 45 seconds.
Yeah. Just great appreciation of the bipartisan consensus around this. I really miss when the Democratic Party was the anti-war party. Now we're going to see probably a majority of Democrats on this vote for cluster munitions that are killing civilians, that will cost taxpayer money, and they're not even the best deterrent. There's just defense contractors that make them and a country that wants them, and so we're willing to accommodate that death. And I think that I hope this debate illuminates the foolishness of the United States exporting cluster munitions. Then we'll have a more responsible consciousness moving forward. I urge the adoption of the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized to close.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
You have 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, we support this bill. We are opposed to this amendment because we want this war to end. We want to bring this war to a conclusion. And the Ukrainians need these munitions to fight for their freedom. No one wants to be in this position of having to argue in favor of cluster munitions. But this is the reality on the ground for Ukraine today. It's also the reality on the ground that the Russians are using far more cluster munitions with far higher dud rates. So don't think for a second that Ukraine doesn't understand they're going to have cluster munitions on the ground that need to be cleaned up. They're mostly going to be Russian munitions. And the longer this war goes on, the longer it takes to push Russia back in this criminal war started by war criminal Vladimir Putin, the more cluster munitions the more unexploded cluster munitions from Russia are going to be on the ground. We have to stand by Ukraine so that Putin doesn't continue this war, not only to take over Ukraine, but to take over Europe. We have to stand by Ukraine to prevent American boys and girls from going to fight. That's why we're in the position we are today. Let's defeat this amendment and let's end this war. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment.